Welcome to this edition of Rattling the Bars. I'm Mansa Musa, co-host with Eddie Conway. First of all, let's acknowledge this, that Eddie is making a lot of progress and he's continued to get better. And we're thankful for all your well wishes and your concerns. We're also thankful for your continue to respect the family's wishes that Eddie has privacy as he recovers. Thank you very much. We also thank you for continuing to support Rattling the Bars and the real news. The prison industrial complex has a lot of problems, and so many is possibly to count them all. But one problem that seems to be going overlooked is the environmental hazards that take place daily in the prison industrial complex. Here to talk about the environmental hazardous conditions that take place in prisons throughout the United States and the world is Paul Wright. Paul Wright is the executive director of Prison Law News, and he's heavily involved in this space. Welcome, Paul, to Rattling the Bars.
Hi, thanks for having me on the show.
First, let's go here first. How prevalent are hazardous environmental conditions in prisons, be it the BOP, state prisons, or county jails? How prevalent are hazardous environment conditions?
It's actually pretty common, and this is the context that the United States has around 3,500 jails, around 2,000 prisons, plus other types of detention facilities ranging from psychiatric facilities to civil commitment facilities, military prisons, immigration prisons, and more. And I think it's important to note that there's almost like two different types of, kind of broadly speaking, there's two main types of environmental hazards that prisoners face. One is where the prison itself is built, the prison or the jail itself is built on literally a toxic waste site. And we have this all over the country. Prisons like the federal prison system in Florence, Colorado, where the Supermax prison is, that's built on literally an abandoned uranium mine. We have a lot of prisons in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and other parts of Appalachia that are built on abandoned mining sites. And these are literally prisons that are on toxic waste sites. And this is kind of why this is very widespread. So on the one hand, you've got the prisons that are built on basically land that's been deemed too dangerous to do anything else with. It's too dangerous for any type of industrial activity. It's been largely abandoned. Then the flip side of it is then you've got the prison itself is the source of the toxic waste. And we see this literally all over the country where prisons, in some cases, literally due to overcrowding, they're sources of everything from raw sewage into neighboring waterways to the prison itself is spewing or dispersing toxic waste, whether it's heavy metals, it's dangerous chemicals, or whatever, into the surrounding environment. And those are kind of the two main things that we see. And because there's so many prisons and jails in this country, it's literally a pretty widespread problem. And the big thing is when it's the former, when it's a prison that's built on the toxic waste site or the prison itself that's kind of physically in a toxic space, the main people that are being impacted by that are the staff and the prisoners, the people that are literally confined there, working there. But then when it's the prison that's the source of the toxic waste, typically it's the prisoners and staff are obviously impacted, but so is the surrounding community. And literally of the cases where the surrounding community is the one that's being most impacted by the toxic waste or the raw sewage or whatever being dispersed or generated by the prison. So those are kind of the two broad categories of toxic waste that we see coming out of or being impacted by prisons.
And I know from experience that in terms of like the first situation where they're built on, most prisons are built on in toxic sites. In Maryland, for example, they have what Eastern Correctional Facility was built on a swamp. So it's sinking, and the waters that are being used by the prisoners either to drink or take showers in is oftentimes polluted, and oftentimes they're told to let the water run or when they take a shower, it feel like they slimy. But let's look at prisons regulated by the EPA or OSHA. Are they regulated to ensure that the hazardous uh, environmental conditions are somewhat kept in check, or are they allowed to like just run amok?
They pretty much run amok. I mean, we've tried for literally for decades to get the Environmental Protection Agency to do stuff about prisons. And it's interesting is that for virtually all of their entire history, the EPA has done nothing about prisons. And that was kind of interesting is in the early 2000s, the Mid-Atlantic region, which of the EPA, which was basically Pennsylvania and Delaware and that area there, they actually took some enforcement actions against prisons. And not a lot, but like, 5 or 6. And they went in, they inspected prisons, they fined them for everything from having old coal-fired water heating plants on prison grounds that were causing air pollution. Those were the main ones. There was also things where fuel storage facilities on the grounds of the federal penitentiary at Lewisburg in Pennsylvania that were leaking, that they also fined them over that. And they did this for around 5 or 6 years. And then not only did they stop doing it, but it was kind of interesting. They also stopped posting this on their website. And not only did they do that, but then they removed it from their website. We were trying to research what the EPA was doing, if they're doing anything else. And we had the documents on our website. We downloaded them from theirs. We put them on ours. And then when we went back to see what else they'd done, we found that the documents they had showing their previous enforcement actions were no longer there. So we called up the EPA and asked them, like, hey, why'd you take the documents down? And they said, oh, we're updating our website. Well, since when does updating means you take the old stuff down? And they never answered that. But basically the EPA, that was almost like an exception to the rule. And I forget how many regions or zones the EPA has. I want to say it's 10 or 11 around the country, but this was the only one. The Mid-Atlantic region was the only one where they ever took any type of enforcement action around prisons, and they only did it for a very limited period of time. They only did it for a couple of years, and then they stopped. And the EPA is not a very transparent organization, so when we've tried to get answers to these questions, we just haven't been able to get them. But the upshot, though, is in answer to your question, is that yes, they very much do run amok. The interesting thing is that then when we've tried looking at whether state agencies are doing any type of enforcement action, you talk about Maryland. In years past, we've reached out to I think it's the Department of the Environment in Maryland to ask them what they were doing about environmental issues in Maryland prisons. And their response was that all their records were on paper. They had them in a filing cabinet. And if we wanted copies of these reports, we're going to have to pay thousands of dollars to get the hard copies. They had nothing electronic. They had nothing they could otherwise share with us or tell us about. So that was kind of, and we found this with a lot of states. Some states are a little bit better. California is one that's interesting. The California Department of the Environment, they've taken enforcement actions against literally dozens of prisons. They impose millions of dollars of fines every year for prisons doing everything from dumping raw sewage into waterways around the prisons and the surrounding environment, to prisons dumping toxic chemicals and dangerous chemicals into the waterways and the environment around the prison. But their whole model is literally one of imposing fines. They don't stop the actual pollution. And it's interesting because when you delve into the reason for this, the federal law under the Clean Water Act, for example, is that no one can sue a toxic polluter if a state agency or another regulatory agency is taking action against them. So what they're doing in California, for example, is the Department of Ecology is fining the Department of Corrections, another state agency, millions of dollars every year for all these toxic water and toxic waste violations. So the money's going from one state bank account into another state bank account. But by doing so, it keeps anyone from suing them privately to get them to stop the pollution in the first place. And
Right.
and the upshot is that there's nothing being done to actually stop the pollution. Also in California, for example, there's prisons in Kern County, the Kern County State Prison, for example. They have incredibly high levels of arsenic in the water, and which is it's a naturally occurring chemical. It's also a known carcinogen, and obviously that's what they use in rat poison. So in high
Right.
enough quantities, it is fatal to humans. In low quantities, prolonged exposure tends to cause cancer, and then it kills you. And
Right.
the CDCR, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, they've known this for years, and basically they keep the prison open, they keep exposing prisoners to the arsenic tainted water, and the other state agencies that are tasked with regulating this, they do nothing because it's another state agency.
Which brings me to my next question, because as you outlined, I remember reading in, I think it was Wolf versus McDonald, a case that dealt with the adjustment. And I think I read where it said it's no iron curtain between the Constitution and prisoners, right? Which brings me to my next question. When I was researching this, I seen where we had made multiple attempts to get some type of judicial resolve on a litigation level. And the standard is so high. Can you speak on that?
Sure. One of the things that's kind of bad about this is the fact that the actual successful litigation around these toxic prison conditions is kind of few and far between. One of the exceptions was a case that the Human Rights Defense Center, of which I'm the director of, recently submitted a friend of the court brief on. Was a case in Connecticut where prisoners were being exposed to radon. And radon is a naturally occurring gas. It comes out of the soil. It's colorless and it's odorless, and basically it impacts a lot of buildings, and especially any places that have hard stones like granite, for example. Those tend to be um, rocks that give off radon. And so the prisoners filed a lawsuit saying, "Hey, we're being exposed to radon, and the state isn't doing anything about it." And so that was one of the things that they that was one of the things that prison officials resisted, and so far the case is still ongoing. And the prisoners are seeking both damages as well as an injunction to fix the problem. And the interesting thing, at least with radon, that's like an easy fix. That's like a couple $100,000 to basically ensure there's better ventilation in the prison, and that literally takes care of the problem for radon. Other problems like toxic water, those are a lot more expensive, and in some cases they're impossible to fix. Like prisons use a lot of water, so for places like the Kern State Prison in California, where there's arsenic in the water, the only real alternative there is literally to shut down the prison. That's about the only thing they can do. There's not a lot of options there. Likewise, I think when you see a lot of these prisons have been built in places like Pennsylvania and Ohio, they're built on abandoned coal mines, and there's problems there with everything from contaminated water, from mining chemicals that have gotten into the water supply, and in some cases, literally the prisons are sinking. And one of my favorite cases was a prison in Ohio, in Lorain, Ohio, that was built on an abandoned coal mine. And they built the prison. They spent $80 or $90 million to build the prison. And then after around 10 years, the ground was settling as kind of the earth was collapsing and filling in these mining shafts and everything else. And so the prison started to sink on top of that. So you had there's some great pictures of these cell blocks where literally the earth sunk like 6 feet, and it's like literally cutting a cell block in half, where all of a sudden, one part of the cell block is 6 feet lower than the other. And so one of the reasons that so many prisons are built on these toxic waste sites is that under federal environmental law, the polluter that basically pollutes the land is responsible for the cleanup. And so what's happened, though, is that by selling this land to prisons and to other to government entities, they're kind of off the hook. They're unloading their liability. When you see some of these,
Yeah.
hundreds of acres of land in Pennsylvania and Ohio, these mining companies sold land in some cases for $1, in other cases for a couple $100,000. Which, on the one hand, you look at it and you say, "Wow, the government got a great deal here." They paid little or nothing for hundreds of acres of land. But it was also really slick on the part of the companies, because what they're doing is they're offloading the liability. As soon as they sold that abandoned coal mine or that abandoned uranium mine to the government, they also wiped out their liability for cleaning it up. And one of the other things that's really been especially distressing at the federal level is a lot of people, folks that are old enough to remember this, at the end of the Cold War, the United States, the military shut down dozens of bases around the country. And the government, in its moment of brilliance there, then decided, hey, we're closing down military bases, but we're building hundreds of new prisons in the 1990s. So instead, what they did, they found that a lot of these military bases, after decades of use, were literally, the bases themselves were toxic waste sites
Hmm.
for everything from spilled fuel to ammunition. The lead from a lot of ammunition from shooting ranges and artillery rounds and everything else was a huge problem. So what they wound up doing was literally the Department of Defense transferred a lot of this land, a lot of these military bases, to the Bureau of Prisons. That's why you've got prisons, and these aren't little prisons either. These are big ones.
Right.
The federal prison in Fort Dix, New Jersey, that's like a 3,000 bed prison. You've got the federal prison in Victorville in California, and so you've got
Hmm.
literally dozens of these former military bases that were pretty much left too contaminated and too toxic for any other land use function. Like, they couldn't turn into residential housing, they couldn't turn into shopping malls or anything like that. So the brilliant idea was, hey, let's build prisons on here.
Right. Yeah. And and I'm recognizing what you're saying, because when we look at the prison landscape, most of the prisons are built in rural America, and it's rural America where a lot of these toxic environmental things take place, where uh, the government allowed for these companies to dump and do things. But let's move on to the the effects of prisoners living in these environments. I heard you say radon, and when I was doing research on this, it say radon is the number one cause of lung cancer of prisoners who are in them environments. And I know for a fact that Eddie Conway has a form of lung cancer, and we suspect and believe that he got it from the Maryland prison system. Can you speak on some of the hazards, some of the health hazards that these in prisons that have these toxic waste environments?
Sure. I mean, I think that the big thing is, the problem with a lot of this stuff is that prolonged exposure, it doesn't lead to immediate, it's not an immediate thing. And the problem is that a lot of this stuff, prisoners are exposed to it, to these, everything from radon to arsenic in the water, to coal ash in the air, uranium in the water supply and also in the air, and things like that. And it tends not to be an immediate thing. It's not as simple as, hey, I drank some water with arsenic and I keeled over dead, or I got
Right.
sick the next day. The way it pans out is you were drinking arsenic contaminated water for 5 years, and then 30 years later you've got bladder cancer, or 30 years later you've got kidney cancer. And same thing with radon, where you breathe in the radon air, and 20, 30 years later you've got lung cancer. And in some respects, I think that's what's made, I think that's almost like this is almost the, kind of the, the fact that these are slow killers. And a lot of times people are, they're dying from this and they don't know why. It's just like, wow, I guess, I got bladder cancer. It's just too bad. I guess that's my bad luck. And they're not making the connection that drinking contaminated water for 5 or 10 years while they were in a prison might be the culprit. Or same thing with lung cancer. It's like, hey, I got lung cancer. Hey, I never smoked. I wonder why that is. And they're not making the connection that being exposed to radon during a period of incarceration may have led to that. So I think these are, I think that's what's kind of the bad thing is not necessarily an immediate thing. Some of the other things too is that we're also seeing with climate change having an increasing impact on the environment. We're also seeing this, especially in places like California and Oregon. As you mentioned earlier, so many of these prisons built in the last 30 years have been built in rural areas. They built a lot of these prisons in areas that are prone to, let's start ticking off the list, forest fires, flooding, hurricane damage. I live here in Florida, and, the last 15 years, between Florida, Louisiana, Texas, literally all the states that border on the Gulf of Mexico have seen prisons and jails literally devastated by flooding and wind damage caused by hurricanes. We're seeing prisons. So far, no prisons have been like wiped out by a forest fire, but we've seen a lot of prisons getting seriously damaged and in danger of getting burned down by forest fires. And then it's one of the things when we talk about the building of prisons on toxic waste sites. There's a couple of which I call the trifecta prisons, where one of my favorite ones as an example is the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, Washington. And this is an immigration detention facility. It's built and operated by the private for-profit company Geo Corrections to house immigration prisoners. And it's built on an abandoned ASARCO aluminum smelter. For like 40 or 50 years, ASARCO had an aluminum smelter there. So the ground is contaminated with cyanide, arsenic, cadmium, all these heavy metals. And then for good measure, it's on a lava flood zone. The jail's like, I don't know, around 10 miles or so from Mount Rainier, which is one of the biggest active volcanoes in the United States. And they expect that if and when it blows up again, which it does every couple hundred years, that basically the lava flowing to the sea is going to go straight through where this jail is. And the amazing thing is that, like, everyone knows this. Like, geologists have known that this is a lava flood zone for decades. And when Geo built the prison there, they knew that it was on an abandoned aluminum smelter that was contaminated. They also knew that it was on a lava flood zone, and they went ahead and built it anyways.
Right. I think you made the case earlier about how corporations allowed to pawn off the cleanup or the collateral aspect of these toxic environments by just getting somebody to come in and buy the property. But let's look at you spoke on two tracks. Let's look at as it relates to the prison environment in and of itself, like a lot of the industry. I know for a fact that I worked in a tag shop when I was incarcerated, and I know a lot of the equipment was antiquated, a lot of the ventilation system, although they tried to upgrade it, but in comparison to what was necessary, they didn't do a good job. From your environment how do you see the prison industry playing into the environmental terrorism that we are talking about today?
The prison industries is a huge source of toxic chemicals and toxic waste in the prison. That's why when I mentioned earlier that in a lot of cases the prison itself is the source of toxic chemicals and contamination to the outside environment. Prison industries is the main one. We've reported in prison legal news over the decades, we've reported so many examples of toxic waste coming out of prison industries, especially stuff having to do. It seems like there's certain industry categories that it's almost like you can almost have like your checkbox. If they're doing anything to do with painting, and in most states, it's prison industries that does the road signs that you see along the interstate and alongside the road. Those are all being built in prisons, and the solvents and the chemicals that they use to make those signs, they wind up just getting poured down the drain and dumped into the waterways or the environment outside the prison. That's like a huge one. The other ones that it's almost like you just check down the list of things that any given prison industry is doing. It's almost like anything to do with chemicals whether it's road signs, state vehicle work, modifying updating state vehicles, stuff like that. Anytime you've got prison industries working with any type of chemical, you can almost bet money that they're being improperly disposed of and they're being dumped or used in a way that's contaminating the environment around the prisons. Those are all kind of like the big ones. The other things too, it's hard. It's kind of one of those things that this only applies to like older prisons, generally ones that were built before 1970, 1975.
Mhm.
Is asbestos is a huge issue in these older
Right.
prisons, and that's just because before the 1970s, asbestos was viewed as literally a miracle mineral, and you can do all
Mhm.
this neat stuff with it, and it doesn't burn. So people thought, the builders, the architects, everyone thought, hey, this is great, and especially for public buildings. And it's not just prisons, but also schools, government buildings of all types, city halls, army barracks, everything else was built with asbestos. And the problem with these older prisons is that you still see a lot of these older prisons, they're still using or they're still contaminated with asbestos.
Right.
Um, and the problem with asbestos is as it ages, it deteriorates and it goes airborne. And when it goes airborne, that's when people are in danger from it. And there's been lots and lots of cases where prisoners and staff are being exposed to this airborne asbestos, and that's another illness that people are exposed to the asbestos. They breathe it in, and it's 20, 30, 40 years later before they start showing symptoms, and it kills them.
Right. And when you talked about the sign shop, see, Eddie Conway worked in the sign shop. When you talk about asbestos, the Maryland prison system from the period that we went in the 70s, and that's basically what you see, asbestos covered pipes. But let's talk about what can the community do, or what can prisoners do to try to reverse this environmental terrorism that's taking place daily within the prison industrial complex.
Well, there's a lot of the stuff as far as, a lot of it has to do also with just first off documenting and improving. And we find that, a lot of times the states, they've actually, if you get the public records, they're testing for this stuff. But the thing is, the public doesn't know about it, or more importantly, prisoners don't know about it. But I also think that one of the leverage points to keep in mind is that, yes, the prisoners are being exposed to it, uh, 24/7 because they're the ones living there. But it's also important to remember that the staff are also being exposed to this stuff, especially things like asbestos,
Right.
anything that's in the air. A lot of times, the water, when you've got the stuff of, the prisons being built, abandoned coal mines and stuff like that. The water, we find there's a lot of prisons where the staff are pretty clear as, hey, we bring in our own water. If it's not coming out of a bottle that we bring in, we're not drinking it. And
Right.
that's usually a pretty good indicator that
Yeah.
probably you shouldn't be drinking the water either if you can
Yeah.
avoid it.
That's right.
But these are things that I think that there needs to be, first off, once you have the awareness about it, you start taking actions to it, and that includes everything from, can you improve the water supply, or if you can't, then maybe you need to shut the prison down. Those are very real issues. Other things,
Right.
as far as stuff like the radon, for example, that's an easy fix in the sense as these things go. It's usually a couple $100,000 for prison. They just got to improve the ventilation to fix radon. Asbestos, that's kind of one of those things. There's gotten pretty good at asbestos remediation where they go in with crews in hazmat suits and take all the asbestos out. The only problem is it's slow and it's expensive. These asbestos
Mhm.
removal workers make a lot of money because it's dangerous work, and it also takes a long time. I've seen the prisons where they go in and remove the asbestos, and usually it's a 2 to 3 year process. In the meantime, the
That's
building,
right.
they've got to close the prison down or close the unit down, while they do it. And the trend from what I've seen with most of the prisons that do it is they don't. It's just they go in and, hey, let's just put more duct tape on the asbestos covered pipes and hope the duct tape keeps everything in.
Right.
That's the cheap and easy solution. And that's what they seem to opt for. Um, But where I think the outside community can and really should be getting involved in, though, are things like where the prison is dumping raw sewage into their water supply, where the prison is the source of toxic chemicals coming from their prison industries, things for their prison industry plants. These are the things that I think that the outside community is literally impacted by. But one of the things that we have found though, when we've tried to organize folks in the community around this stuff, is because all too often the prison is the biggest employer in the county or in the city or whatever, especially in these rural areas. No one wants to say anything. And I used to think when we started doing this environmental work around prisons, I used to think that, regardless of what your views are on criminal justice or sentencing or crime and punishment, no one wants feces in their drinking water.
That's right.
And what I found, though, is that a lot of Americans are perfectly okay with feces in their drinking water as long as it's the government that's putting it there.
Right.
And that's one of the things that's been kind of the big head scratcher for me, is the fact that when you have people, you have communities, they know about this toxic contamination, they know what the source is, but because it's the government doing it, they're okay with it. They figure that, hey,
Right.
500 prison jobs is worth having feces in our drinking water. That's the price we pay to have 500 jobs in our community.
The real news about environmental terrorism that exists in the prison industrial complex. We'd like to thank you, Paul Wright, for coming and enlightening our viewers and our listeners to this travesty that's taking place. This is a human issue.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. And if anyone wants more information about what's happening in prisons and jails, please go to www.prisonlegalnews.org. And we have extensive coverage on environmental issues as well as all human rights issues in American prisons and jails as well.
And we ask everyone to continue to support the real news as we bring forth these horrifying but realistic events that's taking place in the prison industrial complex. Thank you very much.